A school event awakens a silent pain in twin brothers who grew up without their mother. In an attempt to comfort them, the young caregiver agrees to pretend to be their mother, just for today. But the touching gesture triggers a chain of events that shakes secrets, bonds, and loyalties. What begins as an innocent request ends up redefining the meaning of family and awakening love, jealousy, and dark threats. On a sunny September morning, the penthouse apartment in the Upper East Side, New York City, was already bustling with activity. Julia Brooks, a 25-year-old woman with olive skin and curly hair, rushed between the kitchen and the twins' bedroom, balancing a tray with breakfast and freshly ironed school uniforms. Raphael. "Michael, it's 7:30. The bus comes in 15 minutes, Julia called out as she arranged the chopped fruit on colorful plates. The identical twins, with brown eyes that resembled their deceased mothers and dark, perpetually messy hair, emerged from the hallway at different paces. Raphael already dressed and combed. Michael still in his pajamas with a sleepy expression. "Aunt Julia, Michael said there's no school today because it's planetarium day," Raphael reported. Sitting down at the kitchen table, Julia smiled. Already accustomed to Michael's little tricks to skip school, she knelt in front of the boy, still in his pajamas, tucking a rebellious curl that fell across his forehead. "Michael, today is precisely the most important day for you to go. Teacher Deborah sent a special message. The presentation about the solar system you prepared will be seen by all the families at school. Remember how you memorized all the names of Jupiter's moons? Don't you want to show that to everyone?" The boy's eyes briefly lit up, but then a shadow passed over them. "But the other kids will be with their moms," he whispered, so low that only Julia could hear. The young caregiver felt a pang in her chest. The twins had lost their mother, Caroline, during childbirth, a sudden complication no one foresaw. Since then, the children's father, Edward Montrose, a 38-year-old executive at a multinational technology company, had plunged into work as an escape from his grief, becoming an almost ghostly figure in his children's lives. "I'll be there. And Grandma Cecilia also promised to show up, remember?" Julia tried to cheer him up as she led Michael to the bathroom for a quick shower. On the apartment balcony, Raphael watched the city's movement, his eyes following the cars on Fifth Avenue. "Dad promised he'd come today," he said, without diverting his gaze from the intense traffic. Julia bit her lower lip. Edward had promised, yes, just as he had promised on judo presentation day, at the science fair and at the summer festival. But corporate emergencies always arose, and the boy's disappointed eyes became part of the routine. "He'll do his best, Raphael. Your dad works hard to give you everything you need." "Except him," the boy replied with painful maturity for his 8 years. Julia had worked for the Montroses since the twins were 5. Initially, she was just a temporary nanny, recommended by an agency, while she finished her education degree. But she quickly became indispensable, not just for the practical care of the children, but for the genuine affection she developed for them. The penthouse phone rang, interrupting breakfast. Julia answered, immediately recognizing the voice on the other end of the line. "Julia, it's Edward. I'm boarding for a conference in Philadelphia now. An emergency came up with our biggest client. I don't know if I'll be able to make it back in time for the boys' presentation." Julia closed her eyes, trying to control the frustration in her voice. "Edward, you promised them. It's about the solar system. They spent weeks preparing." There was a silence on the other end, broken only by airport announcements. "I know. I'll do my best. If I don't make it, explain to them that work is more important, that an emergency meeting came up, that you're very sorry." Julia interrupted, only to immediately regret her tone. "I'm sorry, it's not my place to say that." "No, you're right," Edward replied with a tired voice. "Tell them I'll try to make it, even if it's just for the end." After hanging up, Julia found the twins already ready, backpacks on, watching her with expectation in their identical eyes. "Was that Dad?" Michael asked. "Yes, he's very busy with an important client, but he said he'll do everything he can to get here in time to see you." The boys' shoulders dropped simultaneously, in a choreography of disappointment that Julia knew all too well. On the way to school, walking through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, Julia tried to cheer up the twins by talking about the presentation, but her thoughts drifted to Edward. She didn't entirely judge him, Losing Caroline had been devastating for him. Julia had joined the family when the wound was still fresh, and saw how lost Edward seemed, torn between grief and the responsibility of raising 2 children alone. However, as the years passed, his absence became a constant presence in the twins' lives. An empty chair at dinner, an unoccupied spot at school meetings, broken promises that accumulated like small scars. New Horizon Academy, a private institution in the heart of the Upper East Side, was decorated with hanging planets and shining paper stars for that day's presentation. The inner courtyard had been transformed into a small planetarium with the class's projects displayed on colorful panels. "Look how many people!" Raphael exclaimed, suddenly nervous at the sight of the arriving parents. "You're going to be amazing," Julia encouraged, straightening the boys' shirts with the school logo. "No one knows more about Jupiter and its moons than you two." Teacher Deborah, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a welcoming smile, approached them. "Hello, Julia. And there are my favorite little astronomers. Ready to shine." Michael partially hid behind Julia, while Raphael managed a shy smile. "They're a little nervous," Julia explained. "That's normal. But it's going to be incredible, you'll see. And are your dads coming to watch?" The teacher asked with the best of intentions. Julia felt Michael squeeze her hand tightly. "Grandma Cecilia is coming, and their father is trying to get here in time. He had a work emergency," she replied diplomatically. As the family settled into chairs arranged in a semicircle, Julia noticed how the twins watched the other children. Girls who adjusted their hair with the help of their mothers, boys who received words of encouragement from their fathers. Complete smiling families taking photos to immortalize the moment. "Aunt Julia," Michael whispered, tugging at her sleeve, "can you pretend to be our mom today?" The request hit Julia like a wave. Raphael, next to his brother, looked at her with pleading eyes. "Just today," Raphael added, his voice choked. "So we're not the only ones without a mom at the presentation." Julia felt a lump in her throat. She knew she should explain that it wasn't appropriate, that she was their caregiver, not their mother. But seeing the twins' teary eyes identical in their vulnerability and hope, something broke inside her. "All right," she replied softly, kneeling down to their level. "Just for today, when you need to introduce me to someone, you can call me that." The boys' faces lit up as if someone had switched on a light inside them. Julia hugged them tightly, feeling her heart pound. "Now let's show everyone how smart you are, okay? You're going to be the brightest stars in this planetarium." What none of the 3 noticed, as they headed to the presentation area, was the figure who hurried through the school's main gate, adjusting his disheveled tie after rushing from the parking lot. Edward Montrose, against all expectations, had made it, and he was about to witness something that would forever change the course of his decisions. Edward Montrose crossed the school's decorated courtyard with hurried steps. His impeccable Italian suit stood out among the casually dressed parents at the school event. He had managed to escape the meeting in Philadelphia early, transferring it to a video conference in the car during the drive to school. His assistant, Marcus, had practically thrown him out of the office. "Your children need you more today than the company does." He was late, but he hadn't missed everything. According to the schedule he held in his hands, the twins' presentation would be the penultimate one. Feeling out of place among the groups of parents who clearly knew each other, Edward sought a discreet spot in the back rows. As he settled in, his eyes scanned the room until they found Raphael and Michael. They were near a large panel about Jupiter, chatting animatedly with Julia. Edward couldn't help but notice how enthusiastically his sons gestured, completely different from the quiet, reserved boys he saw during brief moments at home. The class presentation began. Each pair of students explained an aspect of the solar system. When it was the twins' turn, Edward adjusted in his chair, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. Raphael began talking about Jupiter, his voice surprisingly firm for a child usually shy. "Jupiter is the biggest planet in the solar system. It has many, many moons. Right, Mommy?" Raphael looked at Julia, who smiled encouragingly in the front row. Edward froze. "Mommy?" He must have misheard. Michael continued. "There are 79 moons discovered on Jupiter so far. The 4 largest were discovered by Galileo Galilei, and they are called—" Edward could barely concentrate on his son's words. His eyes fixed on the interaction between Julia and the twins, the naturalness with which they looked at her for approval, the affectionate way she nodded, silently encouraging them. And the moon Europa might have liquid water beneath its icy surface. "Isn't that amazing, Mommy?" This time there was no doubt. Michael had called Julia Mommy, and she had responded with a radiant smile. Edward felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. His cell phone slipped from his hand, falling with a clatter onto the wooden floor. Several heads turned in his direction. Edward, embarrassed, bent down to pick up the device. When he straightened up, his eyes met Julia's. The surprise on her face was evident. She clearly hadn't expected to see him there. She whispered something to the twins, whose faces lit up when they saw him. Edward tried to smile, but his face felt stiff, like a mask. The presentation continued, but Edward barely registered what was happening. In his mind, the scene of his children calling someone else Mommy replayed. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was something deeper and more painful, the realization of his own failure. Caroline was gone, but he too had been absent, leaving a void that Julia had naturally filled. After the presentation, as parents applauded and children ran to embrace their families, Edward remained seated, unable to move. The twins ran to him, their small faces overflowing with joy. "Dad, you came!" Raphael exclaimed, throwing himself into his arms. "Did you see us talking about Jupiter's moons?" Michael asked, jumping with excitement. Edward hugged his sons, feeling their small warm bodies against his. When was the last time he had hugged them like this? He couldn't remember. "Yes, I saw you. You were amazing." "True scientists," he replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. Julia approached hesitantly, carrying the boys' backpacks. There was a tension in the air between the adults, perceptible even to the children, who suddenly fell quiet. "Edward, what a pleasant surprise," she said formally. "The boys were so happy to see you." He nodded, unable to look her in the eyes. "Can we talk later? At home?" "Of course," Julia replied, a slight tremor in her voice. The drive back to the apartment in the Upper East Side was made in uncomfortable silence. Edward drove, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the twins, who, exhausted by the day's excitement, were dozing in the back seat. Julia looked out the window, avoiding his gaze. Not far away, in a cafe overlooking Central Park, Felicity Taylor watched the movement while sipping a cappuccino. At 35, the woman with impeccably straightened blonde hair and long red nails cultivated an image of success. She was a yoga instructor and life coach, with a successful studio frequented by New York City's elite. Her phone vibrated on the table. It was a social media notification. Edward Montrose had posted a photo, something rare. The image showed the smiling twins in front of the Jupiter panel. The caption simply read, "My little astronomers. Congratulations on the presentation." Felicity felt her face flush. She had met Edward at an executive retreat where she had been invited to teach yoga and mindfulness. Their relationship had been brief but intense, at least for her. He was vulnerable, still dealing with the loss of his wife. Felicity saw in him the perfect package, successful, widowed, father of 2 adorable children. But Edward had ended everything 3 months later, claiming he wasn't ready for a new relationship and needed to prioritize his children he barely saw, as she made a point of noting. In fact, she suspected the real reason was that meddling nanny who practically lived in his penthouse. Felicity zoomed in on the photo, noticing a figure partially visible in the corner. Julia, always her. Felicity locked her phone with unnecessary force, startling the approaching waiter. "Anything else, madam?" "No, thank you. Just the check." As she paid, Felicity made a silent promise to herself that Nanny wouldn't be in Edward's life for long. Not if she had anything to say about it. Back at the apartment in the Upper East Side, Edward helped put the twins to bed. It was an almost new experience for him, participating in this nightly ritual. Julia remained discreetly distant, allowing this moment between father and sons. "Dad, will you be here tomorrow when we wake up?" Michael asked, his eyes already heavy with sleep. The question hit Edward like a punch. Was that what his sons expected from him? Just to be present? "Yes, son. And we'll have breakfast together before school." After making sure the boys were asleep, Edward found Julia in the kitchen, organizing lunchboxes for the next day. "Can we talk now?" he asked, indicating the living room. Julia nodded, drying her hands on her apron. In the spacious living room overlooking the illuminated city, they sat on opposite sofas. "About today at school," Edward began, hesitantly. I'm sorry about that, Julia interrupted, the words coming out quickly. The twins asked me to pretend to be… Well, they were insecure seeing the other children with their mothers, and I shouldn't have agreed. It was inappropriate, I know. But they seemed so… Julia, Edward interrupted softly. I'm not angry with you. She stopped, surprised. You're not? No. Edward ran his hands over his tired face. I'm angry with myself. Silence hung heavy between them. I saw how my children look at you, how they seek your approval, your smile, how they feel safe by your side. He paused, swallowing hard. You became their mother while I'm barely a father. Julia seemed uncomfortable with the turn of the conversation. Edward, you are their father. They love you immensely. You've just been busy, it's understandable. No, it's not. His voice came out firmer than he intended. It's not understandable to emotionally abandon my children for years, using work as an excuse. Edward stood up, walking to the window. The city sparkled below, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within the apartments. When Caroline left, he rarely spoke his wife's name. It was as if a part of me also left. Looking at the twins was too painful. They have her eyes, you know. Julia nodded silently. So I buried myself in work. I convinced myself I was doing it for them, securing their future. But the truth is I was running away. He turned to face her. I made my children orphans of both father and mother when they should only have been motherless. Unexpected tears welled up in Edward's eyes. He hadn't cried since Caroline's funeral. Julia instinctively stood up, approaching him. It's never too late to change that, Edward. He quickly wiped his eyes, embarrassed by this display of emotion. I will change. Starting today. He looked at Julia intensely. I want to be present in my children's lives. I want to truly know them, not just buy expensive gifts to compensate for my absence. Julia smiled. Genuinely happy. They'll love that. I'll need your help. Julia, you know their routine, their tastes, their fears. Can you teach me to be the father they deserve? At that moment, something shifted in the dynamic between them. They were no longer just employer and employee, but allies in an important mission, rebuilding a family. Of course, she replied, moved. What neither of them realized as they sealed this new agreement was that the seed of something deeper was being planted that night. And they also didn't imagine that not far away, someone was already plotting to destroy this possibility before it even blossomed. The next day, for the first time in years, Edward had breakfast with his children before school. He cancelled 2 morning meetings and rescheduled a video conference. The twins, initially suspicious of this sudden change, soon brightened when their father asked for details about what they would learn that day. Julia watched the scene with a mix of joy and apprehension. It was what she had always wished for the boys, their father's attention. But a small part of her wondered, what would her role be now if Edward truly kept his promise to be more present? In the following weeks, the apartment in the Upper East Side witnessed a transformation that seemed impossible just a month before. Edward arrived home promptly at 6 o'clock, dismissing his driver and personally picking up the children from extracurricular activities. Family dinners became the rule, not the exception. On weekends, the previously absent executive now organized outings to Prospect Park, visits to the Children's Museum, and even an improvised camping trip in the living room. Julia observed this change with a mix of joy and uncertainty. Seeing Raphael and Michael flourish with their father's attention was everything she had ever wanted for them. But at the same time, she felt displaced in the new family dynamic. At times, she caught herself looking at the trio, father and sons, feeling like an intruder in the perfect picture. One Sunday afternoon, while the 4 of them were having a picnic in Prospect Park, Julia decided to give the family some space. I think I'll take the opportunity to sort out some personal things, she commented, standing up from the blanket spread on the grass. Will you be fine without me for a few hours? The twins immediately protested, while Edward watched her with an expression difficult to decipher. You're part of our Sunday. Julia, Michael insisted, holding her hand tightly. We have ice cream for dessert, Raphael added, as if that were the definitive argument to convince her to stay. Julia looked at Edward, seeking support. He smiled slightly before replying, The boys are right, Julia, you're part of this, he gestured, encompassing the blanket and the children. It's not just work, is it? You could stay if you want. There was something in his voice, a note of vulnerability. She couldn't say for sure, but she felt her face flush under his gaze. All right. I'll stay for the ice cream, she agreed, sitting back down to the twins' delight. Not far away, partially hidden behind a tree, Felicity Taylor watched the scene with narrowed eyes. She wore designer sportswear and huge sunglasses, as if she were just exercising in the park. But her attention was entirely focused on the quartet at the picnic. For weeks, she had followed Edward's life transformation from afar. Rumors in their mutual circle of friends quickly circulated. The workaholic executive now prioritized family, refused happy hours, and had even transferred a business trip to his partner so as not to miss his children's school meeting. So pathetic, she muttered to herself, watching Edward laugh at something Julia had said. Felicity had known several types of rivals throughout her life: sophisticated women, powerful executives, socialites with important surnames. But this nanny, with her simple clothes and unpretentious manner, it was an insult to think that Edward preferred her. Observing the four interact, Felicity noticed something that deeply bothered her. They looked like a family. A real family. The kind of scene she herself had imagined starring in alongside Edward, with the twins initially calling her Aunt Felicity, and then, who knows, Mom? With a sudden movement, she walked away, already plotting her next step. She wouldn't let that intruder steal what she believed was rightfully hers. The next morning, while preparing breakfast for the twins, Julia received an unexpected call from the school principal. "Miss Brooks, this is Martha Campbell from New Horizon Academy. We have a delicate matter to discuss regarding the Montrose twins. Would it be possible for you to come to the school today?" The principal's grave tone left Julia apprehensive. "Has something happened to the boys? I prefer to discuss it in person. Mr. Montrose is also being contacted." After hanging up, Julia tried to call Edward, but he was in a meeting. She decided to go to the school immediately, leaving him a message. In Principal Martha's elegant office, a middle-aged woman with a perpetually serene expression, Julia was received with unusual formality. "Miss Brooks, we have received an anonymous complaint about your behavior with the Montrose twins." Julia felt her blood run cold. "Complaint? What kind of complaint?" The principal consulted some notes before continuing. "According to the report, you are neglecting the children, constantly using your cell phone while you should be supervising them. And," she paused uncomfortably, "there is also an allegation about the consumption of illicit substances in their presence." "What?" Julia stood up abruptly, shocked. "That's completely absurd. I would never do something like that." "I understand your indignation," the principal replied calmly. "We are not making accusations, merely following protocol. We are obligated to investigate any complaint related to the well-being of our students." At that moment, Edward entered the room, looking worried and confused. "Sorry I'm late." "What happened? Are the boys all right?" The principal repeated the accusations to Edward, who listened in silence, his face shifting from surprise to indignation. "This is ridiculous," he stated categorically when she finished. "Julia is the most responsible and dedicated person I know. I've entrusted my children's lives to her for years." Julia felt a wave of gratitude for Edward's immediate defense. "I appreciate your trust, Mr. Montrose," the principal replied. "But please understand that we need to take all complaints seriously. We will conduct a discreet evaluation, observing interactions during school activities. In the meantime, we ask that you be aware and vigilant." On the way back in the car, Julia finally broke down in silent tears. Edward at the wheel cast a worried glance at her. "Hey, don't let this get to you. We both know it's a lie." "Who would do something like this, Edward?" she asked between sobs. "Who would invent such horrible things about me?" Edward kept his eyes on the road, but his expression hardened. "I don't know, but I'll find out. And when I do—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. At the apartment, Edward decided to work from home for the rest of the day. Something in the protective instinct he felt upon seeing Julia unjustly accused bothered him. It wasn't just concern for his children's caregiver. It was something deeper, more personal. While answering emails in the living room, he discreetly watched Julia with the twins. She was playing with modeling clay at the kitchen table, helping them create miniature planets for a new school project. Her cell phone was tucked away in her bag, out of reach. There was no hint of the ridiculous accusations made against her. Who would be interested in harming her? The question spun in his mind without an answer. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Julia found Edward on the balcony, contemplating the illuminated city with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "May I join you?" He nodded, indicating the chair beside him. They sat in silence for a few moments, just observing the lights of New York City. "I'm thinking of resigning," Julia said finally, her voice almost a whisper. Edward turned abruptly to her. "What? Because of this absurd accusation?" "I don't want to harm the boys. If someone is trying to tarnish my reputation, it could affect them too." "I won't let you leave," Edward stated with surprising vehemence, even to himself. "Raphael and Michael need you." He hesitated before adding, "I need you." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Julia felt her heart race. "All these years," Edward continued, "you've become so much more than an employee. Julia, you are—" He searched for the right word. "Family." Before Julia could respond, the intercom rang. It was late for visitors. "Mr. Montrose, sorry for the hour," the doorman said, "but there's a lady here insisting on speaking with you. Says it's urgent, about your children." Edward frowned, exchanging a confused look with Julia. "Who is it?" "Felicity Taylor, sir." Edward visibly paled. Julia noticed his reaction but said nothing. "Tell her I can't see her now. If it's really urgent, she can call me tomorrow." After hanging up, he remained silent for a few moments. "Who is Felicity Taylor?" Julia finally asked. Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Someone from my past. We had a brief relationship a few months ago." Julia felt an inexplicable tightening in her chest. And why would she be here, wanting to talk about the boys? "I have no idea." Edward seemed genuinely perplexed. She only met the twins a few times, briefly. At the reception of the luxurious condominium, Felicity received the doorman's refusal with a forced smile. Inside, she seethed with anger. Edward was rejecting her because of that meddling nanny. She was sure of it. "All right, I'll come back another time," she said sweetly, turning to leave. In the taxi back home, she formulated her next step. The anonymous complaint to the school hadn't had the desired effect. She needed something more forceful, something that would shake Edward's trust in that woman. Days later, during a Sunday lunch in the penthouse, the doorbell rang. Edward answered, finding a delivery man with a large envelope. "Delivery for Edward Montrose." "Signature, please." Intrigued, Edward signed and took the envelope to the living room. Inside, he found several photographs and a printed note. "She's not who you think. Just looking out for your best interests." The photos showed Julia in a bar late at night, talking intimately with a man. In some images, he held her hand across the table. In another, they were embracing on the sidewalk in front of the venue. Edward felt a wave of jealousy? No, it was concern, he told himself. After all, Julia's personal life was none of his business. But something about those photos deeply bothered him. "What's that, Dad?" Raphael asked, approaching curiously. Edward quickly put the photos back in the envelope. "Nothing important, son. Just some work documents." Throughout the rest of lunch, Edward remained distant, observing Julia discreetly. She noticed his change in behavior, but attributed it to work stress. That night, after the twins were asleep, Edward called Julia to his office. Without a word, he handed her the envelope. Julia examined the photos, her expression shifting from confusion to comprehension and then to indignation. "Someone is following me. Taking pictures of me?" Her voice trembled with anger and fear. "Who is he?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Victor, a friend from college," Julia replied, still shocked by the photos. "We met last week because—" She stopped, seeming to struggle with an internal decision. "Because—" Edward insisted, hating himself for the almost accusatory tone. "His daughter has leukemia," Julia replied, tears welling in her eyes. "He called me desperate, needing to vent. His wife was devastated, he was too. He needed a shoulder to lean on." Edward felt ashamed of his suspicions. "Why didn't you tell me you were going out?" Julia stared at him, surprised by the question. "I didn't know I needed to inform you about my personal life. It was my night off, Edward." "That's not it," he quickly corrected. "I'm concerned about someone following you, taking pictures." "That's frightening," Julia nodded, still shaken. Who would do this, and why? Edward hesitated but decided to be honest. I have a suspicion. Felicity, the woman who came here that night, your ex? Yes, our relationship ended complicatedly. She didn't take it well. Julia absorbed the information in silence. Do you think she's behind the complaints at the school too? It's possible, Edward admitted. I'll hire additional security for the building and talk to my lawyer about a possible restraining order. Julia felt a wave of relief that Edward believed her, but also fear of what that woman might do next. I'm scared for the boys, Edward. If she's capable of this. I won't let anything happen to any of you, he replied firmly, approaching her. To none of you. For a moment they were too close, the air between them charged with a tension neither was prepared to name. Edward pulled back first, clearing his throat. We should be cautious in the coming weeks. No predictable routines, be careful when going out alone. Julia nodded, trying to ignore the sense of loss when he moved away. Edward, she called as he headed for the door, thank you for trusting me. He smiled slightly. Always, Julia, always. On the other side of the city, in the minimalist apartment in West Village, Felicity watched the same photos on her laptop, frustrated that they hadn't caused the desired impact. Through a contact at Edward's building's concierge, she knew Julia was still there, seemingly without problems. You leave me no choice, darling, she murmured to Edward's photo on her screen. I'll have to be more persuasive. October arrived in New York City, bringing intense rains and suffocating humidity that seemed to amplify tensions. In the Upper East Side apartment, routine continued with apparent yet vigilant normality. Edward had installed additional cameras in the hallway and hired a private security guard to accompany Julia and the twins on outings. Is this really necessary? Julia asked as she watched Anthony, the nearly 7-foot-tall security guard, waiting patiently in the building's lobby to take them to school. I prefer to overdo the precaution than regret it later, Edward replied, adjusting his tie. We don't know what Felicity is capable of. In recent weeks there had been no more incidents, no complaints, no mysterious deliveries, no sign of Edward's ex-partner. This, instead of reassuring them, only increased the tension like the calm before a storm. Edward's phone rang. It was his mother, Cecilia Montrose, an elegant 65-year-old lady who lived in a grand house in Greenwich Village. Son, I need to talk to you. It's about the twins. The urgent tone alarmed Edward. Has something happened, Mother? I received a very disturbing call last night. A woman, she didn't identify herself, saying terrible things about Julia. Edward felt his stomach sink. What kind of things? I prefer not to repeat it over the phone. I'm on my way to your office. Can we have lunch? After hanging up, Edward found Julia in the kitchen, preparing snacks for the twins. My mother received an anonymous phone call about you, he said bluntly. Julia dropped the knife she was using to cut fruit, her face paling. She didn't say what. But she's coming to talk to me, Edward continued. I think our friend Felicity is escalating the situation. Julia took a deep breath, trying to control her anxiety. Edward, this is getting scary. This woman is obsessed. I'll handle this, I promise. He approached, placing his hands on her shoulders in a comforting gesture. Trust me. His touch, even brief, sent a shiver down Julia's spine. In recent months, something had changed between them. Glances that lasted an extra second, casual touches that seemed laden with meaning, late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours. Neither dared to name this change, but it was there, palpable like the tension before a summer storm. At the elegant restaurant near Edward's office, Cecilia Montrose nervously tapped her fingers on the table as she waited for her son. At 65, she maintained an impeccable posture and perfectly dyed hair, in a constant battle against time. Widowed 7 years ago, she had dedicated herself entirely to the family business and her grandchildren after her husband's death. Mother, Edward greeted her with a kiss on the forehead before sitting down. What happened? Cecilia looked around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard before leaning towards her son. A woman called last night, very distraught. At first I thought it was a mistake, but she knew my name, she knew about the boys. What did she say? That your nanny, Cecilia paused, choosing her words, that Julia was abusing your trust. That she often goes out at night when you're traveling, leaving the boys alone. That she receives men in the apartment. And most seriously, that she was The lady lowered her voice even more. Stealing from you. Edward felt a wave of anger. That's completely absurd. Julia would never do something like that. Cecilia studied her son carefully. You seem very sure of that. Because it's the truth, Mother. I've known Julia for years. She's the most honest and dedicated person I've ever met. A significant silence hung between them. Is there something you're not telling me, Edward? He averted his gaze. I don't know what you're talking about. Son, Cecilia covered his hand with hers. I'm your mother. I've known that look since you were 6 and broke my Chinese vase. Edward sighed, giving in. Things have changed between us, Mother. I care about her. More than I should. Cecilia didn't seem surprised. And does she know that? We haven't talked about it. It's complicated. Because of Caroline. Edward nodded slightly. Even after 8 years, his wife's memory still lingered as a silent presence in his life. I think I feel guilty, he admitted. As if I'm betraying Caroline by being interested in someone else. Cecilia squeezed her son's hand affectionately. Edward, you know Caroline would never want you to spend your life alone. She wanted you to be happy, to give the boys a complete family. I know, he replied softly, but that's not all. Julia is an employee. She's much younger. The boys adore her. And there's this crazy woman stalking me. What woman? Edward briefly explained about Felicity and his suspicions that she was behind the accusations against Julia. This is very serious, Cecilia commented, worried. You should contact the police. And say what? That my ex is spreading rumors? We don't have concrete evidence, Mother. Meanwhile, at the yoga studio in West Village, Felicity led a class for stressed executives, her serene smile perfectly masking the inner storm. When she finished, she checked her phone, finding the confirmation she expected. Meeting scheduled for Thursday, 3 p.m. The message came from Cecilia Montrose. After attending to all clients, Felicity locked herself in her office. She opened a folder on her laptop containing all the information she had collected about the Montroses. Photos of Julia with the twins, school schedules, Edward's routine, even the floor plan of the apartment in the Upper East Side, obtained through a contact at the real estate agency. You chose the wrong adversary. Darling, she murmured, zooming in on a photo of Julia smiling at the twins in the park. No one humiliates me and gets away with it. On Thursday, promptly at 3 in the afternoon, Felicity arrived at the elegant afternoon tea at the Museum Gardens Cafe, a sophisticated establishment in the Upper East Side area. She wore a navy blue silk ensemble that enhanced her light eyes, her hair impeccably styled in a low bun, the image of respectability. Cecilia was already waiting for her, equally elegant in her beige suit. Mrs. Montrose, thank you for agreeing to meet me, Felicity greeted sweetly, extending her hand. I confess I was curious, Cecilia replied, studying the woman in front of her. It's not common to receive anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Felicity had the decency to look embarrassed. I apologize for the hour. I was very distraught at the time. And why exactly are you so interested in my son's employee? Straight to the point, Felicity thought. She liked that. Mrs. Montrose, what I'm about to tell you is difficult but necessary. She paused dramatically. I have reason to believe that this young woman, Julia, is not who she appears to be. And what would those reasons be? Felicity opened her expensive purse, pulling out an envelope. I have her criminal record here. I obtained it through a lawyer friend. She was accused of theft by a previous employer. Cecilia took the envelope but did not open it. If that's true, why didn't my son discover it in a background check? Because the case was dismissed for lack of evidence, Felicity replied promptly. But the suspicion remains. The Montrose matriarch studied the woman in front of her with experienced eyes that had seen many lies over decades in business. And what is your interest in all this? Miss Taylor. Felicity Taylor. She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. Mrs. Montrose, your son and I had a relationship. It was brief but significant. We broke up because he said he wasn't ready for a new commitment after the loss of his wife. And you think Julia is the reason? I'm sure, Felicity stated, her eyes gleaming with conviction. She manipulates him, using the twins as instruments. I've seen how she acts, making herself indispensable, creating situations to appear like the savior. Cecilia maintained a neutral expression. That sounds like jealousy to me. Miss Taylor. Felicity flushed slightly. It's not jealousy, Mrs. Montrose, it's genuine concern. Edward is a vulnerable man, still dealing with grief. The boys need stability. This young woman is taking advantage of the situation, first emotionally, now financially. And what do you suggest I do? Felicity leaned in, lowering her voice. Confirm it for yourself, test her. People like that always show their true nature when pressured. In the Upper East Side apartment, Julia finished helping the twins with their homework when Edward arrived, earlier than usual. His face showed concern. Has something happened? She asked when the children ran to their room. My mother is coming for dinner tonight, he replied, loosening his tie. She wants to get to know you better. That's unexpected. She asked me a lot of questions about you after that phone call, Edward explained. I think she's worried. Does she believe the accusations? She says no. But she wants to form her own opinion. He approached, lightly touching Julia's arm. Don't worry, my mother can seem intimidating, but she's fair. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Cecilia was warm towards Julia, interested in her education and her plans for the future. The twins, delighted by their grandmother's presence, behaved exceptionally well. You have a special touch with children, Cecilia commented as Julia served dessert. Raphael used to be so shy, now he can't stop talking. He always had a lot to say, Julia smiled. He just needed someone who really listened. Edward watched the interaction between the two most important women in his children's current lives, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. His mother seemed genuinely impressed with Julia, but he knew her too well not to realize something more was going on. After putting the twins to bed, Julia returned to the living room to find Edward and Cecilia talking in low voices. Both fell silent when she entered. I'll finish tidying the kitchen, she said, feeling suddenly uncomfortable. No need, dear, Cecilia interjected. Sit with us. I'd like to get to know you better. The dear sounded strangely false to Julia's ears, but she obeyed, sitting in the opposite armchair. Julia, my son tells me you're studying pedagogy, Cecilia began. Plans to open your own school someday? Maybe, but at the moment I'm happy where I am. I imagine so, the lady smiled slightly. Edward is a generous employer. Something in the tone made Julia straighten in her chair. It's not just for the salary, Mrs. Montrose. I love Raphael and Michael as if they were, she hesitated. As if they were yours, Cecilia completed. I was going to say as if they were part of my family. An uncomfortable silence hung in the room. Edward cleared his throat. Mother, it's getting late. Would you like me to ask the driver to pick you up? Cecilia ignored him, still observing Julia. You know, dear, I've always been good at judging people's character. It's a gift, and you seem sincere to me. She paused. But also extremely naive if you think this can work out. Mother, Edward warned. Sorry, I don't understand, Julia replied, tense. Cecilia leaned forward. A beautiful young woman like you, taking care of the children of a rich and vulnerable man. Beginning to understand. People talk, dear, and they don't say pleasant things. Enough, Mother, Edward stood up furious. You promised not to do this. Cecilia also stood up unperturbed. I'm just protecting our family, Edward, as I always have. Julia is part of our family now, he replied with surprising firmness. The silence that followed was electric. Julia remained seated, stunned by Edward's declaration and Cecilia's barely disguised hostility. The matriarch looked from one to the other, a sudden understanding illuminating her face. I see, she said finally. It's more serious than I thought. Edward did not back down. Yes, it is. Cecilia picked up her purse, preparing to leave. Then I suggest you be cautious. There are people very interested in separating you. She cast a meaningful glance at Julia, and they won't play fair. After Cecilia left, Julia and Edward remained in silence for long minutes. Finally, she found the courage to ask, What did you mean by me being part of the family? Edward approached, sitting beside her on the sofa. Exactly what I said, he replied, his voice low and intense. Julia, these past few months, something has changed. You must have noticed. She nodded, her heart racing. Me too. I'm scared, he admitted. Scared of messing everything up, of losing you, of confusing the boys. I'm scared too, she whispered, but even more scared of not trying. Edward gently touched her face. We can take it slow, one day at a time. When their lips finally met, it was as if a tension accumulated for months finally found release. The kiss, initially hesitant, deepened with an urgency that surprised them both. Edward's hands tangled in Julia's hair, while she clung to his shirt. The sound of the doorbell abruptly separated them. Breathless, they looked at each other with a mixture of surprise and desire. "Who would that be at this hour?" Julia asked, adjusting her disheveled hair. Edward stood up, trying to regain his composure. "I'll check." In the empty hallway, he found only an envelope on the floor. Inside, a single photo, him and Julia seconds before kissing in the living room. Attached, a handwritten note. "How touching. Enjoy it while you can." Edward felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Someone was watching them, someone much closer and more dangerous than they imagined. The discovery of the photo and the threatening note transformed the apartment in the Upper East Side into a fortress in the following weeks. Edward hired a security team to check the entire building, installed an advanced alarm system, and changed all the locks. To the twins, everything was presented as security improvements, but the tension between the adults was palpable even for 8-year-olds. "Why is Dad so angry lately?" Michael asked one night as Julia helped him with his pajamas. "He's not angry, dear," she replied, trying to sound casual. "Just worried about work." "And why are those men in black walking around the building?" Julia hesitated. The twins were too perceptive for obvious lies. They're people who help keep everyone safe. "Safe from what?" Raphael insisted, appearing at the bathroom door with his toothbrush in hand. "From problems," she replied vaguely. "Sometimes in big buildings like ours, it's good to have extra people looking after everything." The boys exchanged identical glances that clearly said the adults are hiding something, but they didn't insist. Julia felt a pang in her chest. She hated not being completely honest with them, but how to explain that an obsessive woman was stalking the family? In his office, Edward spoke in a low voice with Mark Thompson, a private investigator recommended by his lawyer. "Did you manage to find out how the photo was taken?" Mark, a middle-aged man with a permanently serious expression, nodded. "There's a blind spot in the building's camera system, exactly in the area that overlooks your living room. Someone who knew the building well would know that. What about the note? Any fingerprints?" "It was certain, nothing useful. It was written with gloves, probably. Whoever did this knows what they're doing." Edward ran his hands over his tired face. "Did you get any information about Felicity Taylor?" "Some interesting details." Mark consulted his notes. "There have been 2 restraining order requests against her by ex-boyfriends in the last 5 years, both alleging obsessive behavior, trespassing, stalking." "My God," Edward murmured. "Even more concerning, she took a lock-picking course." "What? How is that legal?" "It was presented as escape techniques for emergency situations, part of a survival training. But the skills are the same." Edward felt a chill down his spine. "Do you think she could break into the apartment?" "With the current system, unlikely. But I would reinforce surveillance at service entrances and the garage. And I wouldn't leave the children alone with Miss Brooks." "Julia poses no danger to my children," Edward replied categorically. "I'm not suggesting that," the investigator clarified. "I'm saying that if this woman is as obsessive as she seems, she might try to get to you through the people you love. Miss Brooks and the children are vulnerable targets." After the investigator left, Edward found Julia in the kitchen preparing tea. Since the kiss 2 weeks earlier, they had maintained a cautious distance from each other. The threat hanging over them had cooled the initial ardor, replacing it with a constant sense of vigilance. "What did the investigator say?" she asked, pushing a cup towards him. Edward recounted the conversation, omitting only the part about not leaving the children alone with her. Julia listened in silence, her face progressively paling. "So she really is dangerous," she concluded, her voice almost a whisper. "Mark thinks we should file a police report, but without concrete proof that it's her. What if something happens to the boys?" Julia asked, fear evident in her eyes. "Edward, maybe I should step away for a while. She seems to see me as the problem. If I leave the scene—" "Absolutely not," he interrupted, taking her hands. "I won't let an unbalanced person dictate our lives. The boys need you. I need you." The look they exchanged was charged with unspoken promises. Edward leaned in, brushing his lips against hers delicately. "We'll get through this together," he murmured against her mouth. The next morning, Cecilia Montrose arrived unexpectedly for breakfast. bringing croissants from a French bakery that the twins adored. The atmosphere was strangely friendly, with the matriarch helping Julia set the table. "They're looking more and more like Edward at this age," Cecilia commented, watching her grandchildren running around the living room. "The same inexhaustible energy, and the same stubbornness," Julia added with a smile. "You seem to know them very well." After 3 years together, it would be hard not to know. Cecilia observed the young woman carefully. "You know, Julia, when my husband passed away, I thought I'd never see Edward truly happy again. Even before Caroline's passing, he was always very reserved, very focused on work." She paused. "In the past few weeks, I've seen a sparkle in his eyes that I haven't seen in years." Julia felt her face flush. "The boys have that effect on him." "It's not just the boys." "Dear," Cecilia smiled slightly. "I'm not blind." Before Julia could respond, Edward entered the kitchen, surprised by his mother's presence. "To what do we owe the honor, Mother? Can't I visit my grandchildren anymore?" she replied, feigning offense. "Besides, we need to talk about Julia's birthday." Edward frowned, confused. "Your birthday is coming up," he asked Julia. "Next week," she confirmed. "But it's nothing big, no need to—" "Nonsense," Cecilia interrupted. 26 years deserves a celebration. I was thinking of a family dinner at my place. Something small, elegant." Edward and Julia exchanged surprised glances. This sudden change in Cecilia's behavior was unexpected, and frankly a little suspicious. "That would be lovely," Julia replied cautiously. "Perfect. Friday, 8 o'clock. Edward, bring a good wine." Cecilia clapped her hands, satisfied. "Now, who wants a croissant?" After breakfast, as Edward walked his mother to the door, he couldn't contain his curiosity. "What are you up to, Mother?" Cecilia adjusted her scarf with dignity. "I'm not up to anything. Just trying to get to know someone who is clearly important to you and my grandchildren better. This change is very sudden. Last week you practically accused her of being a gold digger." "A mother has the right to change her mind," she replied serenely. "I observed how she is with the children. How you are together. Perhaps I was mistaken." Edward studied his mother's face, looking for signs of deceit. "I just don't want Julia to feel uncomfortable." "I promise to behave," Cecilia assured, kissing her son's cheek. "Until Friday." On Friday night, the Montrose mansion in Greenwich Village glowed under soft lights. Dinner was served on the covered terrace, with a view of the illuminated garden. To Julia's surprise, Cecilia had made a genuine effort. Her favorite dish was on the menu. There were flowers she had casually mentioned liking in a previous conversation, and even the twins were exceptionally well behaved, as if they had received special instructions from their grandmother. "Everything is wonderful, Mrs. Montrose," Julia commented during dessert. "Thank you for this dinner, Cecilia dear. I think we can drop the formalities now." Edward watched the interaction with growing astonishment. He had never seen his mother so welcoming to someone outside the family circle. After dinner, while Edward and the twins explored the old board game collection in the attic, Cecilia led Julia to her private office, an elegant room decorated with antiques and family photos. "I have something for you," she said, taking a small velvet box from a drawer. "It was my mother's, then passed to me, and I always thought I'd give it to Edward's wife someday." Julia felt her heart race as Cecilia opened the box, revealing a delicate sapphire and diamond brooch. "It's beautiful, but I can't accept something so valuable and significant. Consider it a loan." "Then," Cecilia insisted, pinning the brooch to Julia's blouse, "to wear tonight." The gesture was so unexpectedly affectionate that Julia felt tears in her eyes. Maybe she was wrong about Cecilia. Maybe the matriarch was truly accepting her as part of the family. The evening continued with board games, laughter, and even Cecilia sharing embarrassing stories from Edward's childhood, to the delight of the twins and the embarrassment of their father. When it was time to leave, Julia truly felt like part of the family for the first time. In the car, on the way home, Edward smiled as he drove. "I've never seen my mother so warm. What did you do to her?" Julia laughed. "Nothing. I think she just needed time." "Well, whatever it is, I'm impressed." He reached out, entwining his fingers with hers. It was a perfect night. Back at the apartment, after putting the twins, exhausted and happy, to bed, Julia went to her room to change. She carefully removed the brooch Cecilia had lent her, putting it back in the velvet box. As she prepared for bed, she mentally replayed the surprising evening, feeling a wave of hope for the first time in weeks. The sound of raised voices in the living room jolted her from her reverie. Quickly pulling a bathrobe over her pajamas, she rushed to see what was happening. In the living room, she found Edward and Cecilia standing, both looking deeply disturbed. In one of the armchairs, a housemaid from the Greenwich Village residence waited nervously. "What's going on?" Julia asked, worried. When Edward turned to her, his face was pale, his eyes as hard as she had never seen them before. "My sapphire brooch is missing," Cecilia replied, her voice trembling. "Regina here says she last saw it when I showed it to you in the office." Julia felt her blood run cold in her veins. "But it's here," she said, rushing back to her room. She returned seconds later with the velvet box, opening it to show the brooch. "You lent it to me, remember?" Cecilia looked at the jewelry with an enigmatic expression. "I showed it to you, dear." "I didn't lend it." "But you put it on my blouse," Julia insisted, confusion and panic growing within her. "You said it was a loan to wear tonight." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Cecilia replied, her voice suddenly cold. "I showed the jewel as part of a tour of the office, but then I put it back in the desk drawer. Or at least I thought I did." Julia looked at Edward, expecting support but found only doubt in his eyes. "Edward, you don't believe I—" Her voice trailed off. "Julia, just explain how the brooch came to be with you," he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I already explained. Your mother gave it to me as a loan for the evening." Tears began to form in her eyes. Why would I lie about that? A heavy silence fell over the room. Cecilia retrieved the brooch with slightly trembling hands. "Perhaps it's best we all go to sleep," she suggested, her voice gentler now. "We're all tired, and I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." When the matriarch and the maid left, Julia and Edward remained in the living room, an invisible chasm growing between them. "You don't believe me?" she stated, her voice choked. Edward ran his hands through his hair, clearly conflicted. "I want to believe you, Julia, but my mother would never lie about something like this." "Neither would I," she exclaimed, the pain of his distrust burning like acid. "In 3 years, have I ever given you reason to doubt my honesty?" "No, but what? She's your mother, so she's automatically right? Even after everything we've been through together?" Edward seemed genuinely torn. "I need time to understand what happened, Julia. All of this is convenient," she completed bitterly. "Your mother finally accepts me, invites me to dinner, shows me a family jewel, and suddenly I'm accused of stealing it. Don't you see what's happening? Are you suggesting my mother set this up? I don't know. Maybe—" Julia stopped, a sudden understanding illuminating her face. "Felicity, she might have manipulated your mother somehow." Edward sighed heavily. "Julia, I know we're all scared by this situation, but not everything is a conspiracy. Sometimes people simply get confused." "I'm confused now," she replied, tears streaming freely. "Confused about how you could doubt me after everything." She turned to leave, but Edward grabbed her arm. "Julia, please, let's talk about this tomorrow when we're calmer." She pulled her arm away, freeing herself from his touch. "There will be no tomorrow, Edward. Not for us." The words came out before she could stop them, but seeing the shock on his face, she knew they were true. Trust was everything to her. Without it, there was no foundation to build anything. "What are you saying?" I'm saying I'm leaving. Tomorrow morning, this—" She gestured between them. "It's over before it even began." "And the boys?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. The thought of leaving Raphael and Michael made Julia's heart contract painfully. They were like sons to her, but remaining in that house under suspicion would be even more painful. "Find someone else to care for them," she replied, each word costing a piece of her soul. "Someone you truly trust." That night, as she packed her things, Julia cried silently. Not for the lost job, nor for the aborted romance, but for the love of the 2 boys she would have to leave behind. The only comfort in her broken heart was knowing that at least Edward was present in their lives now. The next morning, she found the twins in the kitchen, already dressed for school. Seeing her bags in the hallway, the boys immediately understood. "Are you leaving?" Michael asked, tears already shining in his eyes. Julia knelt down, getting to their level. "I have to go, darlings. But that doesn't mean I don't love you, do you understand?" "I'll always love you." "Did Dad make you leave?" Raphael questioned, his voice trembling. No, it was my choice. The white lie came easily. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions, but you're our family. Michael sobbed, throwing himself into her arms. Julia hugged them both tightly, allowing herself this last moment of connection, and I always will be, no matter where I am. In the boys' room, she left 2 small packages on their beds, gifts she had bought for Christmas, still far away. Inside, handmade friendship bracelets, a tradition she had started in her first year with them. Edward remained at the door, silently watching the farewell. When the twins finally calmed down, he sent them to brush their teeth. "You don't have to do this," he said to Julia when they were alone. "Yes, I do." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "For their peace, and mine. What if I told you I believe you?" Julia looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Too late," she replied softly. "If you really believe me, you would never have hesitated last night." Edward didn't reply because he knew she was right, and as he watched her walk out the door, carrying only 2 suitcases and a broken heart, he felt as if an essential part of his family was leaving with her. The apartment in the Upper East Side became an unrecognizable space in the weeks following Julia's departure. Silence weighed like a physical entity, broken only by Michael's nightly crying and Raphael's constant sighs. Edward tried to compensate for her absence, coming home earlier from work, hiring a new highly recommended nanny, Mrs. Ann, an experienced 60-year-old lady, and organizing weekend outings. Nothing worked. "Why aren't you eating?" he asked one night, watching the twins play with their food without interest. "Mrs. Ann made lasagna your favorite dish." "It's not the way Julia made it," Raphael replied, pushing his plate away. "Julia put basil on top," Michael added, "and made the edges crispier." Edward sighed. It was always like this now. Every detail, every activity, every corner of the apartment carried Julia's memory. The boys didn't let anyone forget her absence, like sentinels guarding her memory. At night, after unsuccessfully trying to get the twins to sleep, they now insisted on staying together in the same room. Edward retreated to his office with a glass of whiskey. He was exhausted, but sleep no longer came easily. He opened his laptop to work, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, where he could see a piece of New York City's starry sky. Where was she now? Was she all right? The questions constantly tormented him, but his pride prevented him from calling. After all, it was Julia who had decided to leave, who had cut all ties. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his mother. "How are the boys?" Cecilia asked, her voice conveying genuine concern. "Badly," Edward replied sincerely. "They don't eat properly, they don't sleep well, they don't smile anymore. Children are resilient, son. They'll get over it." "I'm not so sure." He took a sip of whiskey. "They loved her mother, as if she were their mother," Cecilia completed softly. A heavy silence fell on the line. "Mother," Edward began hesitantly. "That night, are you sure you didn't give the brooch to Julia to wear?" Cecilia took a moment to respond. "Edward, we've already discussed this. Why are you bringing it up again? Because nothing makes sense. Julia never lied to me before. And she seemed so convinced." "People who lie well often seem convinced," Cecilia replied, a defensive tone in her voice. "Or maybe they were telling the truth," Edward countered. "Mother, you said you were taking your migraine medication that night, the one that sometimes affects your short-term memory. Are you suggesting I imagined everything? That I unfairly accused that young woman? I don't know what to think anymore," he confessed. "I just know that my family is falling apart, and I need to understand what really happened." After hanging up, Edward remained motionless, contemplating the amber liquid in his glass. A week after Julia's departure, the school principal, Martha Campbell, had called with disturbing information. The anonymous complaint against Julia had been traced. It came from a public phone near his mother's house in Greenwich Village. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. But why would his mother do something like that? Cecilia could be rigid and protective, but never cruel. Unless a suspicion began to form in his mind. He picked up the phone again, calling Mark Thompson, the private investigator. "I need you to investigate a possible connection between my mother and Felicity Taylor." The next morning, the deep dark circles under Edward's eyes showed another sleepless night. As he prepared breakfast for the twins, a clumsy attempt to make pancakes like Julia, his cell phone vibrated with a message from Mark. Urgent information. Can we meet today? The day passed slowly, with Edward distracted in meetings, his thoughts always returning to the enigmatic message. Finally, in the late afternoon, he met the investigator at a discreet cafe in the West Village. What did you find? Mark slid a folder across the table. Your mother and Felicity Taylor met at least twice in recent weeks. Once at the Museum Gardens Cafe, another time at her house in Greenwich Village. Edward felt his blood run cold in his veins. Are you sure? Absolutely. I have photos, entry records to the condominium, everything here. He pointed to the folder. There's more. I found evidence that Felicity has been observing your apartment for weeks. She rented a flat in the building across the street, with a direct view into your living room. My God, Edward murmured, understanding how the photo of the kiss had been obtained. Did your mother know about this? I can't say for sure, but according to her condominium's security camera records, Felicity visited her the afternoon before Miss Brooks's birthday dinner. Edward closed his eyes, feeling a mix of anger and despair. She manipulated my mother, and I let Julia leave. There's one more thing you should know, Mark continued, his tone grave. The school contacted the police about that anonymous complaint against Miss Brooks. Apparently there have been other similar complaints against other school employees. All false, all traced to different public phones, but with the same writing pattern. Felicity? Probably. And that constitutes libel and defamation. Edward stood up abruptly. I need to find Julia, fix this. I've already taken care of that, Mark replied, handing him a card. She's working here as a teacher's aide. Started 2 weeks ago. The address indicated a municipal daycare in East Harlem, far from the luxury of the Upper East Side. Arriving home, Edward found his mother in the living room, talking to the twins. Her expression upon seeing him betrayed that she knew something was wrong. Boys, why don't you go play in your room for a bit? I need to talk to Grandma. When the children reluctantly left, Edward threw the folder on the coffee table. When were you planning to tell me about your meetings with Felicity Taylor? Cecilia visibly paled. Edward, I can explain. Please explain. Explain why you secretly met with a woman who is stalking my family. Explain why you lied about the brooch. I didn't lie about the brooch, Cecilia protested. That young woman took it without permission. Stop, Mother! Edward raised his voice, something rare in his relationship with Cecilia. Felicity manipulated you, planted doubts about Julia, made you distrust her. It wasn't like that, Cecilia insisted, but her tone no longer carried the same conviction. Felicity just warned me to observe her behavior more closely. And did she happen to mention that she had been stalking Julia for weeks? That she made false complaints against her at school? Cecilia seemed genuinely surprised. What? No, she never. She said she was worried about you, about the boys. She's obsessed, Mother. She's dangerous. And you let her into your house, allowed her to poison your mind against someone who only brought good to our family. Tears began to form in the matriarch's eyes. I just wanted to protect you all. Ever since Caroline left, I've been so afraid of seeing you hurt again. Well, congratulations, Edward replied bitterly. You achieved exactly the opposite. Thanks to this manipulation, I lost the only person who made this house feel like a home again. That night, after a long conversation with his mother, who finally admitted to having been influenced by Felicity, and that yes, she might have actually lent the brooch to Julia and forgotten due to her medication, Edward sat down with the twins for a serious talk. What do you guys think about visiting Julia tomorrow? The boy's eyes, so much like Caroline's, instantly lit up. Is she coming home? Michael asked, hopeful. I don't know, son, Edward replied honestly. I did something very wrong. I doubted her when I should have trusted her. Not all the apologies in the world can easily fix that. But you're going to apologize, right? Raphael insisted. I am, and I'm going to ask her to come back. But the decision will be hers. The next morning, after dropping the twins off at school, Edward drove to East Harlem, his heart pounding as he navigated unfamiliar streets. The Sunshine Daycare was a simple but well-maintained building, with children's drawings decorating the exterior walls. After identifying himself at the reception, he was led to an inner courtyard, where small children played under the supervision of several educators. It was there that he saw her. Julia was sitting on a small bench helping a girl of about 4 tie her shoelace. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a colourful apron over casual clothes. Even from a distance, Edward noticed that she looked thinner, with slight dark circles under her eyes, but her smile when interacting with the children remained genuine. When she finally looked up and saw him, the smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of shock. "Julia, there's a gentleman who wants to talk to you," a colleague announced unnecessarily. Julia slowly stood up, saying something to the child before approaching. "What are you doing here?" she asked without greeting him. "I needed to see you." "To talk?" Edward hesitated. "Are you okay?" "I'm working," she replied, avoiding the question. "This isn't a good time. When would be?" Julia sighed, looking at her watch. "My break is in 20 minutes. We can talk briefly at the coffee shop on the corner." Those 20 minutes were an eternity. Edward waited in the small cafe, watching ordinary people come and go, a reality so distant from his corporate world in the Upper East Side. When Julia finally entered, looking uncomfortable and reserved, he realized how much his pride had cost him. "How are the boys?" was her first question as she sat down with a cup of plain coffee. "Missing you." "We all are." Julia nodded, avoiding his gaze. "What do you want, Edward?" "I only have 15 minutes. He took a deep breath. "I found out everything. About Felicity manipulating my mother. About the false complaints, about how she was watching us. Should that surprise me?" Julia asked bitterly. "I told you she was behind everything." "I know, and I should have believed you." Edward reached his hand across the table but didn't dare to touch hers. "Julia, I came to ask for your forgiveness. For doubting you, for not defending you, for letting you leave." She finally looked directly at him, her eyes teary. "Do you know what hurt the most? It wasn't losing the job, not even being away from the twins. It was realizing that despite everything we went through, you didn't trust me." "Not really." "I was confused," Edward tried to explain. "It was my mother on one side, you on the other. And you chose her version," Julia completed, "even knowing she was taking medication that affected her memory." Edward lowered his head, ashamed. "There's no excuse for it. I can only say that I deeply regret it." A heavy silence fell between them. "The twins ask about you every day," he continued. "Raphael keeps the notes you left in a special box. Michael sleeps with the bracelet you gave him." Silent tears began to stream down Julia's face. "I miss them too. Every day." "Come back to us," Edward pleaded, his voice almost a whisper. "Please, the house isn't the same without you." Julia wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "It's not that simple, Edward. Trust once broken isn't easily mended. I'm willing to try, to do whatever it takes to win it back." She studied him for a moment as if assessing his sincerity. "And your mother?" "Felicity. My mother is devastated to realize how she was manipulated. She wants to apologize to you personally." He hesitated before continuing. "As for Felicity, I filed a police report. There's enough evidence for a restraining order against her." Julia nodded slowly. "I need to think, Edward. I can't just abandon these little ones." She gestured towards the daycare. "They're counting on me now, too." "I understand." Edward couldn't hide the disappointment in his voice. "But please at least visit the twins. They miss you so much." "That I can do," she replied with a small smile, the first since they met. "This weekend, maybe." It was less than he hoped for, but more than he deserved, Edward thought, as he watched Julia return to the daycare. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, Edward proved his determination. Every day after dropping the twins off at school, he drove to East Harlem to visit Julia at the daycare. Initially, she kept her distance, accepting only brief conversations during her breaks. But gradually, as he continued to show up, her reserve began to melt. Edward didn't just visit. He got involved. He helped fix broken toys, painted walls, organized a book donation drive among his executive colleagues. The daycare staff, initially suspicious of the man in the suit who seemed out of place in that simple environment, began to look forward to his visits, impressed by his willingness to literally get his hands dirty for the children's sake. At home, he transformed Julia's room into an untouched sanctuary, awaiting her return. The twins, refreshed by her visit on the first weekend, made a calendar counting the days until their next meeting. Cecilia, in turn, wrote a long letter of apology to Julia, explaining how she had been manipulated and begging for a chance to rebuild their relationship. She accompanied the letter with a box containing the sapphire brooch, not as a loan, but as a permanent gift. One rainy afternoon, while helping to reorganize the daycare's small library, Edward and Julia found themselves alone for the first time in weeks. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked finally, curiosity overcoming her reserve. "Because it's where you are," he replied simply. "That doesn't make sense. You could be working, doing more important things." "Nothing is more important now than showing you every day that I'm committed, but that I won't give up." Julia smiled slightly. "You're different." "I'm trying to be the person you deserve," Edward admitted. "Someone who puts family first, who isn't afraid to show what they feel, who fights for what's truly important." She studied him for a moment. "And what's truly important to you, Edward?" "You," he replied without hesitation. "You, Raphael and Michael. Our family." The word "our" hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Slowly, Julia took a step towards him. "I'm still scared," she confessed. "Scared to trust again, scared to get hurt. I know. And I can only promise that I will do everything in my power to never again betray that trust." Edward extended his hand, and this time she accepted it. "One day at a time?" "One day at a time," she agreed. Outside the daycare, a figure watched the scene through the rain-streaked window. Felicity Taylor, wearing sunglasses and a hat as a disguise, clenched her fists as she saw Edward and Julia holding hands. The plan with Cecilia Montrose had failed spectacularly, but she wasn't ready to give up. "Enjoy it while you can," she murmured, walking away before anyone noticed her presence. The game was not over. In fact, it was just entering its most dangerous phase. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Julia, Edward, and the twins has touched your hearts. To follow more exciting journeys like this, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this story of family, trust, and true love moved you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the transformations that love can achieve. Share in the comments which moment of this story touched you the most. Was it Julia's courage, Edward's transformation, or perhaps the unconditional love of the twins? We look forward to reading your impressions and continuing this journey together.